Good Shabbos. This week is Parshas Kedoshim, but today on Friday is also Hey Iyar, the fifth day of Iyar, which is the day that we celebrate Yom Haatzmaut, Israel Independence Day. This year it was celebrated on Thursday, the fourth day of Iyar, in order to avoid any conflict with Shabbos, which would come late in the afternoon on Friday. The question I'd like to address today is, from a religious point of view, how do we understand the establishment of a secular state of Israel, and especially as it was originally established in the early years as purely secular, with the religious parties not being that involved. And of course, the main thrust of the government was labor socialism, and really was not looking at the Torah as a guide for the establishment of the state. So there were many different views in the religious world how to understand the historical event of the establishment of a state. For some, they were anti-Zionist up until today, because they're saying that we have to wait for a Mashiach, a Messiah, to come from the King of David, waiting somewhat for an apocalypse where God will reveal Messiah, and there will be the war of Gog and Magog, Armageddon, and a temple will sort of come down from the heavens, and that will be the coming of Messiah. There are others that were kind of sort of parav in regard to the establishment of a state. It's almost like let's take a wait and see attitude. And as the history developed, there were many religious parties which said, yes, we'll be involved in the government, but not really part of the essential part of the government. In other words, they're not standing up and saying the state is a beautiful thing that we have to look at from a religious point of view, from a Torah point of view, but we deal with it like we deal with any other environment that we're in, and political establishment, and we'll take part as much as we have to in order to make sure that whatever could be done from a religious point of view should be done. And then, of course, there's religious Zionists, and the main thrust of this approach was established by Rabbi Kook, who was the first chief rabbi in Palestine. And he saw this from a mystical point of view as this is the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people, that what's happening is that the Israeli government and the secular Zionists are sort of like the guf, the body, and the religious element are the neshama, or the soul, and we work together and we move towards a ideal state that will incorporate both the secular power that comes with the establishment of a state and the religious aspect which will come with the view of the Torah. Myself, I'd like you to understand that where I come from, it was more of like that middle ground, where there was never this anti-Zionist type of view, but the way I was raised in the schools that I was raised, it was just sort of not addressed at all. We were somewhat parav towards the state of Israel, assuming that we're not anti because these are Jews who are looking for independence and making sure to save many Jews, especially in 1948 after World War II and the Holocaust. But it still was run by a secular government, and the Constitution is still not the Torah. As I got older, I had finally went to Israel when I was already 30 years old, and I think the first thing that I realized when I landed in Israel and was even in a religious community is that people were speaking Hebrew, and Hebrew was something which was revived, that didn't exist as a spoken language for thousands of years, and even in the most religious communities, Hebrew was what was spoken. And the yeshivas were flourishing. Religious Judaism was sort of more established in Israel than probably at any time in history. There's more people studying in yeshivot than ever existed. And now you go back another 30 years later, and you see a state which is flourishing on all levels, technologically, economically, and even the democracy includes all parties. There's a diversity. Is it a perfect state? Obviously not. There are many issues and many problems that surround the Israeli government and what our future is going to be and what lies for us in the future, whether that's politically or worried about the nuclear threat from Iran or from the different enemies that surround us, but just sort of standing back and trying to understand what this looks like within sort of the larger view of history. It does sound, as we say in the blessing that we have for the state of Israel, that we say in this shul, is it's reshit tzmichat gulatenu. It's the beginning of the flowering of redemption. In other words, do we see this as an aberration, as something which should not have happened and is out of the norm and is not something willed by God? Or do we see this as history moving forward, maybe at a slower pace than we originally expected, but in one sense it's at a faster pace than we expected? Because who would have thought that we would have what we have today in Israel 75 years ago or 80 years ago? It would be just a dream. And the question is, for example, one of the questions dealt with in the religious circles is, do we say Hallel on that day? And when do you say Hallel? You say Hallel, you say the praises of God when you see a miracle. And is this a miracle, or is this just history as in going in its natural flow? And here, I think it's important to understand the different views of miracles and the different views of the coming of Messiah. On the one hand, there's the approach that I mentioned before, the waiting for an apocalypse, the waiting for a nisim gluyim miracles which are very obvious and way beyond nature. Or we could see this as nisim nistarim, as hidden miracles, miracles which lie within nature, somewhat similar to the miracle that we associate with Purim. When you're involved in the story of Purim, you don't necessarily see a miracle. When you step back and read the story, you see this as something which not necessarily can we prove that it was ordained by God, but if that's not a miracle, the question is, what is a miracle? And that's how I view the state of Israel. I view the state, and from Maimonides' point of view, the way Messiah comes is through natural occurrences. And the way we expect from the Messiah is not necessarily miracles. We expect everything to flow the way it did in nature also. And in nature, you don't expect things to happen within 1 year, 2 years, or maybe even decades, but it could be over 100 years or 200 or 300 years. And we could see this very easily as a miracle. And it's a miracle which could be explained away through nature. But a miracle isn't always something which has to be beyond nature. It's God making sure and directing that things go right eventually, whether for the Jewish people or for the world at large. And as I like to say all the time, and quote Yeshayahu, Isaiah, that we are supposed to be an Ar Lagayim, a light unto the nations. And what better way than to establish a country which acts with morality and deals with the different people that are under our sovereignty, under our control in a humane way. Are we perfect at that? No, far from it. But we're moving in that direction. And hopefully the world sees what the Jewish people are doing, and they start to understand that the state of Israel is here to stay, and that we add to the world. We add to the world, whether it's economically or whether it's the way we establish democracy, how we treat other people. Do many countries look at us that way? No. All you have to do is walk into the UN and see that there's still a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. But slowly but surely, at least in my lifetime, we see a cold peace with Egypt, with Jordan. Now we see a peace with the other Arab countries, and it's warming up, and it's warming up with Egypt. There's relationships that exist between Israel and other countries, and an interdependency with other countries. And I think we never know the future. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We certainly don't know what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years. But I think it's fair to say that no different than many times in Jewish history when people had a view and said, this is the time when Messiah is going to come. Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah when he rebelled against the Romans. How wrong was he? It became a terrible tragedy. But at the time, it certainly looked that way, and he was correct, according to Maimonides and others. He was correct in saying this has the possibility of being Mashiach, being Messiah. And I think we have the right and maybe the obligation to say we are in the beginning of Messianic times, and we should celebrate the Israel Independence Day as the miracle that I think it really is. Good Shabbos.